History of Kamala Harris. A child of Berkeley. She was born in 1964 in Oakland, the hospital a little over a mile from the city hall where, more than half a century later, she would announce her short-lived 2020 bid for the presidency. Born to immigrant parents who met while getting their PhDs and protesting for civil rights at UC Berkeley, she spent her childhood in Berkeley. Harris' father, Donald Harris, is from Jamaica and her mother, Shyamala Gopalan, is from India. The couple split when Harris was 7, and Harris and her sister Maya were raised mostly by her mother, who died in 2009. In the first Democratic presidential debate in 2019, Harris famously skewered Joe Biden, then her campaign rival, for his past opposition to federally mandated busing to desegregate public schools. For Harris, she said, the issue was personal. Specifically, Harris rode the Red Rooster from Berkeley's working-class flatlands to Thousand Oaks Elementary School at the base of the affluent North Berkeley Hills. This was 1969, just 1 year after Berkeley Unified introduced its two-way busing program across its elementary schools. Berkeley being Berkeley, unlike local integration plans across the country, the city had undertaken this one on its own accord. After the debate dust-up, Harris clarified that she does not support federally mandated busing, a policy stance not so dissimilar from the one she needled Biden over. Traversing back and forth between different strata of society, black, white and Asian, well-off and working class, is a familiar trope in Harris' biography. It wasn't a homogeneous life, said Debbie Meslow, a friend who has also worked for Harris as a communication director and a consultant. She's a very resourceful person in that she can move in between these worlds. Harris spent her teenage years in Montreal, moving there with her sister and mother when Gopalan accepted a university research position there. She earned a political science and economics degree at Howard University in Washington, D.C. but returned to California to get her law degree in 1989 at the University of California, Hastings in San Francisco. Until her most recent move to Washington, she called California home. Fresh out of law school, she joined the Alameda County District Attorney's Office in 1990, serving there 8 years before crossing the Bay to San Francisco. In 2003, she unexpectedly won election as San Francisco District Attorney, where she served 2 terms before her narrow election as State Attorney General in 2010. She was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2016. The influence of King/Queen maker Willie Brown. Former State Assembly Speaker and San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown has helped accelerate many a successful political career in California. Harris got a boost from Brown, too. In March 1994, San Francisco Chronicle's legendary columnist Herb Kahn described the scene at Brown's surprise 60th birthday party. Clint Eastwood was there, wrote Kahn, and he spilled champagne on the speaker's new steady, Kamala Harris. Brown had a reputation for dating much younger women. In his column, Kahn described Harris, then a deputy district attorney of Alameda County, as something new in Willie's love life. She's a woman, not a girl. The relationship ended after 2 years, but her connection to Brown, 3 decades her senior, did have an outsized effect on her career. I would think it's fair to say that most of the people in San Francisco met her through Willie. John Burton, who used to be president pro tem of the state senate, former chair of the California Democratic Party and a San Francisco political powerhouse in his own right, told Politico. The speaker gave Harris a couple plum positions on 2 state regulatory boards, the Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board and the California Medical Assistance Commission. If you were asked to be on a board that regulated medical care, would you say no? Harris told SF Weekly a few years later. Harris' connection to Brown also helped her make connections across San Francisco high society and California political elite. In 1996, a year after Brown became mayor and Harris broke off the relationship, she joined the board of trustees at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. When Harris ran for San Francisco District Attorney nearly a decade later, her first contribution came from Elaine McKeown, chair of the museum's board. More, much more, poured in from donors with last names like Fisher, Getty, Buell, Haas and other noble houses of the Bay Area. But from the beginning of her political career, Harris has seen her connection with Brown as a liability, a cudgel that opponents can use against her and, at worst, a tired, sexist trope used to question the legitimacy of her ascendant career. In the first run to be San Francisco's district attorney, Harris deliberately hired a campaign consultant known for working with clients outside the Brown political machine. During that same campaign, she described her past relationship with the former Speaker and Mayor as an albatross hanging around my neck. And in 2020, Brown wrote that if Biden offered her the chance to be his running mate, she should turn him down, noting that the glory would be short-lived, and historically, the vice presidency has often ended up being a dead end. A lack of clarity. You saw it in the presidential race. You've seen it in her as vice president. As the New York Times once put it, the content of her message remains a work in progress. We saw it before in California. While running the California Department of Justice, Harris was often loath to wade into the political battles taking place just a few blocks away in the state legislature. There was the bill that would have required her office to investigate police shootings. She did not take a formal position. The bill died. There was the proposal to force police departments to gather data on the ethnicity and race of the civilians they stop. Harris also declined to take a position. It passed anyway. And on the biggest criminal justice overhaul in California in a generation, Harris also kept mum. Prompted by a judicial decree that the state had to dramatically cut the population of its overcrowded prison system, realignment was a package of state policies passed in 2011 that shifted tens of thousands of inmates out of state custody and into county jails or onto the rolls of local probation systems. Despite in many ways reflecting the lessons described in her book Smart on Crime, which argued that non-violent criminals can be redirected into less punitive systems without jeopardizing public safety, Harris, the state's top law enforcement officer, was silent on the policy. The idea that she would have consistent positions on issues informed by ideology isn't who she is. Hat earned a rebuke from the Los Angeles Times editorial board, which wrote in its endorsement of her 2016 Senate candidacy that Harris has been too cautious and unwilling to stake out a position on controversial issues, even when her voice would have been valuable to the debate. What some critics call prevarication or flip-floppery, her supporters call pragmatism. Those are just two ways of describing the same quality, said Corey Cook, a political scientist and provost at St. Mary's College, and a longtime observer of San Francisco politics. She's not an ideologue, he said, meaning rather than stake out the boldest, ideologically coherent agenda, she tends to focus on individual fixes to specific problems. Hence the 3 a.m. agenda of her presidential campaign, a collection of policy changes designed to address the problems that keep the average voter up at night. The idea that she would have consistent positions on issues informed by ideology isn't who she is, said Cook. Harris may appear to pick her battles, he said, because for her the only lasting solutions are going to be the ones that are able to sustain a majority coalition of support. Making a mark: domestic violence, child abuse. Harris has never shied away from the tough-on-crime label when it comes to a certain class of criminals: domestic violence perpetrators, child abusers and sex traffickers. After nearly a decade in Alameda County and a short stint as a deputy district attorney in San Francisco, in 2000, Harris joined the San Francisco City Attorney's Office under Louise Wren. Wren said she was looking for someone to head the office's Child and Family Service Unit, which investigates child abuse cases. This was not considered a prestigious post. Prosecutors inside the unit had taken to calling it kiddie law. Wren thought Harris, who had focused on child abuse and sexual exploitation cases in Alameda County, would be a good fit. That instinct was confirmed on Harris' first day on the job, Wren said, when a number of children who had been separated from their parents were formally adopted into new families. She comes into my office and says, "Come on, Louise, we've got to go over to court." There are going to be adoptions today, and she had all these teddy bears, Wren recalled. She knew the occasion. She knew it was an important one and it should be celebrated. Harris' focus on the victims of abuse and exploitation continued after she was elected as San Francisco's district attorney. I don't know what the term teenage prostitute means. I have never met a teenage prostitute. I have met exploited kids, Meslow, then Harris communications director, recalls her boss saying at her first all-staff meeting. Harris then ordered her prosecutors not to use the term in court. A year later, Harris sponsored a bill putting the crime of human trafficking into the state criminal code. Some Democrats say Harris' prior life as a prosecutor with a focus on sex crimes would be a key advantage in a potential general election contest against Trump, who has been found liable in a civil case for sexual assault and recently became the first former president to be convicted of a felony. In that case, the 34 counts were related to the falsifying of business records in connection to an alleged sexual encounter with a pornographic film actress. But using the full force of the law to penalize pimps, traffickers and other abusers has earned Harris some criticism from civil libertarians and from advocates for sex workers. In one of her final acts as California's Attorney General, Harris had the CEO of Backpage.com, Carl Ferrer, arrested on pimping charges. Backpage was an online classified site known for its adult services section, which prosecutors had long warned served as a marketplace for sex traffickers. The arrest was based on a contentious legal argument that pit anti-trafficking fervor against the First Amendment. Since Backpage was merely a platform for ads, its lawyers argued, it was protected by the same law that protects Google from being held liable for illicit websites listed in its search results. A Superior Court judge agreed and threw out the case, though an amended charge, pursued by Harris' successor, then Attorney General Xavier Becerra, led Ferrer to plead guilty to money laundering and conspiracy to facilitate prostitution and to the shuttering of the site. 5. The Harris Mantra, Smart on Crime. One of the reasons Harris became known as a rising star district attorney was her focus on prevention, which she explained in her book, Smart on Crime, written in 2009, the year before she ran for Attorney General. Public health practitioners know that the most beneficial use of resources is to prevent an outbreak, not to treat it, Harris wrote. Instead of just reacting to a crime every time it is committed, we have to step back and figure out how to disrupt the roots of infection. Harris' Back on Track program, considered the most successful implementation of this idea, redirected first-time, non-violent drug offenders into supervised education, job training courses, therapy sessions and life skills classes. It was a modest program, but a novel one compared to what most other big city law enforcement officers were doing in 2005. In that time period, I think that she was a radical, said Meslow. The program has since been emulated by cities around the country. When Harris became Attorney General, she launched a similar pilot program for Los Angeles County. Harris' focus on prevention produced some of her key accomplishments as district attorney. But in the context of the 2020 presidential primary, some of those same accomplishments struck many critics on the left as overly punitive. The year after launching Back on Track, Harris introduced an anti-truancy initiative. Based on a statistical correlation that chronic class skippers are more likely to be both perpetrators and victims of homicide, Harris' office began threatening the parents of persistently absent students with prosecution. Harris has been quick to point out that the stick in this carrot and stick approach only came out after a series of escalating interventions, including mandatory meetings with school staff and social workers. No one went to jail under the program, though a handful of parents were fined. Within a few years, city truancy rates fell by a third and Harris took credit. In 2010 her office sponsored a bill to take the program statewide. In the hands of other district attorneys, the statute was used in at least a handful of cases to put parents behind bars. Critics have said that the policy has been disproportionately wielded against poor parents of color. In a 2019 interview, Harris said she regretted any unintended consequences of the state law. Harris has always opposed capital punishment. Her opposition to the death penalty has been one of the most controversial stands in her career, but it's also an example for those who criticize her lack of consistency. On April 10, 2004, 3 months after her inauguration as San Francisco's new district attorney, 29-year-old police officer Isaac Espinosa was gunned down by a 21-year-old with an AK-47. 3 days later, Harris made good on a campaign promise and vowed not to seek the death penalty for the shooter. David Hill was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The decision engendered a predictably fierce backlash from the police union and rebukes from politicians. "This is not only the definition of tragedy," Senator Dianne Feinstein said at Espinosa's funeral, "it's the special circumstance called for by the death penalty law." The assembled officers cheered while Harris remained seated. Some of Harris' critics say she has wavered in tougher political circumstances. In 2014, when a federal court judge ruled that California's administration of the death penalty was unconstitutional, Harris appealed the decision as state attorney general, arguing that it was not supported by the law. Harris later said that she was obligated to defend capital punishment as the legal representative of the state. Many have pointed out that she was happy not to defend a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage that voters passed in Proposition 8 when it was challenged a year earlier. Harris' response: she was merely reflecting the position of her client, Governor Jerry Brown's administration. She also explained that the judge's ruling, which held that the long delays between sentencing and execution in California amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, could be used to justify speeding up the state's system of capital punishment. Prosecutorial overreach controversies. Both as district attorney and as state attorney general, Harris led offices that criminal justice advocates say was overly aggressive in pursuing convictions and lacked transparency in a way that belies Harris' brand as a progressive prosecutor. In March 2010, just as Harris was campaigning to become California's attorney general, San Francisco authorities shut down a police department crime lab in the city's Hunters Point Naval Yard. A technician named Deborah Madden was accused of skimming drugs, raising broader questions about the lab's ability to appropriately handle evidence in criminal cases. Harris immediately dismissed 20 drug cases, but the number eventually grew to over 1,500 after documents showed that prosecutors within Harris' office had known about Madden's potential unreliability months before the lab was closed, but had neglected to tell defense attorneys. A Superior Court judge later excoriated Harris' office, writing that the violations infringed on the defendant's constitutional rights. Afterward, Harris formed a unit to handle the sharing of evidence with criminal defense attorneys. She has also said that she did not know about the problems at the crime lab until after the scandal blew up. But that hasn't done much to assuage the concerns of critics who say Harris had a tendency toward prosecutorial overreach, which continued once Harris became the state's attorney general. In 2015, for example, lawyers for an inmate convicted of murder attempted to have the case thrown out after new evidence suggested that Riverside County prosecutors lied on the stand during the initial trial. Harris' office, representing the state prison system, resisted, only backing down after footage of one of her deputies being eviscerated by 3 federal judges went viral. A spokesperson for her since-abandoned presidential campaign said Harris ordered her office to drop the challenge as soon as she became aware of the case. Critics point to other examples. There was her office's decision to defend a molestation conviction that local prosecutors had secured with a false confession. Asked about that case, the spokesperson said that it was long-standing practice for prosecutors within the Californian Department of Justice to file legal motions without the express approval of the Attorney General, implying that, again, Harris was not aware that her office was making the argument. But in this case, the spokesperson added, state prosecutors believed the original case was valid and that the victim in the case deserved justice. Another example, her office's refusal to take over a 2011 Seal Beach mass shooting case after a judge recused the entire Orange County District Attorney's Office for widespread prosecutorial misconduct. Harris defended her decision. It was being handled at the local level. Such a track record is to be expected of any prosecutor, said Sally Lieber, who worked with Harris on human trafficking legislation while representing Mountain View in the state assembly. It is an adversarial system, and so she was filling a particular role, but I think that she was able to do it in a very sophisticated, smart and responsive way, she said. As California's AG, playing hardball. Harris' biggest accomplishment while California's Attorney General was to secure a financial settlement with some of the country's largest banks accused of illegally foreclosing on homeowners. In September 2011, Harris pulled out of ongoing negotiations between attorneys general from nearly every U.S. state and the 5 banks, calling the proposed deal of $2 to $4 billion crumbs on the table. Harris was not the first attorney general to walk away, but the departure of the country's largest state seemed to have its intended effect. A few months later, with California back in the mix, a new deal was struck. This time, California got $20.2 billion in debt reductions and direct financial assistance. Still, some consumer groups and outside experts were critical of the deal, arguing that the banks would have been forced to write off much of that bad debt eventually. All sizzle, no steak, is how Georgetown law professor Adam Levitan put it. But Harris' willingness to play hardball did result in a bigger settlement, said Rob McKenna, former Washington Attorney General who was part of the negotiations. It's possible for states to overstate the impact they had on the final settlement. The former New York Attorney General would sometimes make claims about the settlement and improvements he had obtained, he said. But it's fair to say that Attorney General Harris negotiated and obtained some improvement in the settlement for California. Kamala the campaigner. Harris launched her 2020 presidential campaign high on fanfare and hype, only to flame out less than a year later before even making it to Iowa. It was a historically stark-under performance from a candidate that many Democratic insiders believed would be a formidable contender. In California, Harris' electoral track record has been mixed. Her first spin on the campaign trail was a superlative success. In her 2003 race for San Francisco District Attorney, she pushed out a 2-term incumbent and won more votes than any other candidate running for a citywide office that year. Harris' first run for statewide office didn't go quite smoothly. Her race for Attorney General against Republican Steve Cooley wasn't called until weeks after Election Day. Yes, Harris won. But she did so by less than a percentage point. Now, after 18 years in which not a single Republican has won statewide office in California, it's easy to look back at that nail-biter of an election and see an early sign of Harris' weakness as a candidate. But at the time, the calculus was a little different. Cooley, a relative moderate, was considered the favorite to win against Harris, a San Francisco liberal. This was 2010, which proved to be a historic landslide election for the GOP. The fact that Harris eked it out despite those headwinds, and as the first woman and person of color to hold that office no less, cemented her status as a rising star in the Democratic Party. Also rising was Gavin Newsom. The two were San Francisco friends and ran in the same social circles even before their political careers ignited. They shared the same political consultants. And when the two most prestigious California elective offices opened up, for governor and U.S. senator, they sidestepped a ballot rivalry when she successfully ran for the Senate, as did he for governor. Newsom has said, and recently reiterated, that he would not challenge Harris for the Democratic presidential nomination should Biden withdraw. Although Newsom's name frequently appears on lists of hypothetical Biden replacements, Biden's endorsement indicates she is the heir apparent. On January 20, 2021, Kamala Harris was sworn in as vice president, the first woman, the first Black American, and the first South Asian American to be elected to this position. As vice president, she has worked to bring people together to advance opportunity, deliver for families, and protect fundamental freedoms across the country. She has led the fight for the freedom of women to make decisions about their own bodies, the freedom to live safe from gun violence, the freedom to vote, and the freedom to drink clean water and breathe clean air. While making history at home, She is also representing the nation abroad, embarking on more than a dozen foreign trips, traveling to more than 19 countries, and meeting with more than 150 world leaders to strengthen critical global alliances. The Vice President has been a trusted partner to President Joe Biden as they work together to deliver monumental achievements that are life-changing for millions of Americans. Together, they have invested in the economy to create a record number of jobs and keep unemployment low. Their work has led to more small business creation in a 2-year period than any previous administration. They capped the cost of insulin at $35 a month for seniors, cut prescription prices, and improved maternal health by expanding postpartum care through Medicaid. They passed the first meaningful gun safety law in 3 decades. Forming a bipartisan coalition, they enacted a $1 trillion investment in the country's infrastructure to remove every lead pipe in America and make the most significant investment in public transit, repairing bridges, and high-speed internet in history. As President of the Senate, Vice President Harris set a new record for the most tie-breaking votes cast by a vice president in history, surpassing a record that had stood for nearly 200 years. And her votes have been consequential. This includes casting the decisive vote to secure passage of the landmark Inflation Reduction Act, the largest investment ever in tackling the climate crisis. She also presided over the unprecedented vote to confirm the first black woman, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, to the Supreme Court while working alongside President Biden to achieve historic representation of women and people of color among nominees at all levels of the federal government.